Hi there, I'm Andy Owen. I'm the International Technical Manager for ICL Turf and Landscape, and I'm joined by my colleague, Henry Bechelet, who is the Technical Sales Manager for ICL for the UK and Ireland. We're currently presenting three short technical update videos with a focus on Anthracnose, and this is the third in the series. In the first video, I chatted to Kate Entwistle from the Turf Disease Centre. We spoke a little bit about the background of the disease, its biology and pathology, and how we identify that. And then in the second installment, Henry and I talked through some of the background factors which give rise to the development of anthracnose in the sward, and talked a little bit through some of the general literature which focuses on the subject. But in this third installment, we want to drill down into the practical advice and the management of the disease practically. So I'll come straight in and ask you, Henry. So when we're talking about managing anthracnose, what's the sort of initial conversation? What are the first few things you might say?
Well, we discussed this earlier, and in a previous presentation, anthracnose is one of those ones where there's kind of that's in the hands of the turf manager to a certain degree. So there's lots of different factors. But a place you might sort of start is, if we're talking about disease, is the fungicide. And it's maybe not the first thing that you lean at, but just for the sake of discussion. In the UK and Ireland, we've got the sort of Syngenta portfolio with Heritage Max, Strata Elite and Medallion, and all of them really effective against anthracnose. So there are fungicides there that can really help and should form a part of the thought process. But as with all fungicides, they need to be used preventatively, don't they? Anthracnose. If it's a basal rot of the disease, and you sort of already started to develop, the base of the plant's been rotted away and the leaves are starting to yellow, the application of a fungicide is not going to mend that. And so, if we do consider fungicides, we need to use the right material at the right time, and the right time is before you need it on the run up to that event. But there's lots of other factors as well. This is a disease where our sort of management practice has a huge influence.
Yeah, I think the research on the fungicides is really clear, and I think we mentioned it briefly with Kate. The primary factor is getting on preventatively. I think they say between 2 or even 4 weeks before you see the symptoms developing of that yellowing of the leaf. What was clear from the research is that the fungicides are more effective, or even more effective, when you have other management practices in play to reduce the stress of the turf for the surface. And so, as you say, there are management practices that are in the hands of the greenkeeper to deploy to reduce the incidence of the disease. So after fungicides, or not after, but one of the key management practices, what would you say it would be?
Well, I mean, turf nutrition is always kind of huge in any kind of disease management strategy, isn't it? Keep the plant strong and healthy. And I suppose the sort of trend in greenkeeping in UK and Ireland in sort of recent years has been sort of a gradual reduction in nutrient inputs, nitrogen inputs in particular. There's sort of a move to foliar feeding during the summer, for instance, maybe applying less than you would if you were applying sort of granular feeds. And then there's this kind of fear of applying too much fertilizer during the autumn for fear of kind of encouraging microdosing patch at a later date. So, I think in quite a lot of greenkeepers' minds, maybe there's this sort of desire to get below 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year for their greens, which is quite, that's kind of, it's not borderline for certain grass types, but for annual meadowgrass, it is there. And that might be sort of figuring into maybe a resurgence or a constant battle against the development of anthracnose. That sort of the trend seems to be sort of heading towards invoking a little bit of stress. Now, what did the research say about that?
Yeah, you're right, absolutely. I mean, there's some clear research that focuses down on these management practices, and would really look at the work coming out of Rutgers University from Bruce Clark's research group, where they looked at all these factors. The research is great. It's extensive. There's lots of co-authors in some of the published papers. There's articles. There's a range of presentations as well to view. And on nutrition, they're really clear. Both nitrogen and potassium play a critical part. And on nitrogen, they say that, regular applications through the summer period, going into the autumn, looking at, at least 2 to 5 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per week, for a moderate outbreak, will significantly reduce that outbreak. They do recommend above that 5 to 10 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per week, which is
That's quite a lot.
Which is quite a lot. But they do say 2 to 5 applied regularly, so either through liquid spoon feeding or with the application of a slow release granular fertilizer, can make great strides in reducing the severity of any anthracnose outbreak. So,
I mean, it doesn't have to be a prescription, does it, Andy? I mean, it can be just sort of to understand the relationship between nutrition and the development of the disease.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And then they follow that up with some work to show that potassium is also important. And you should be careful not to let your potassium levels in your root zone drop too far. And the work was really nice, actually. They looked at levels of potassium in the root zone following a malic 3 extraction, and there was a cutoff point that was between 40 to 50 ppm. And as long as your K levels were sort of above that, they felt that anthracnose wasn't developing as often or as severely. So the recommendation from that work was clear. Nitrogen is important. Keep the potassium in your root zone, and you should reduce the outbreak of the disease. From the root zone analysis as well, it was quite nice. They also linked to soil pH. They were clear to say that pH was not as critical as the key nutrients, nitrogen and potassium, but they did see increased incidence of anthracnose as the pH dropped below sort of 5.5, that level. So again, that was another factor that would play its part.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of, and just antigrowth doesn't like it, does it? When you get sort of too acidic, and sort of in terms of sort of, practical advice, regular soil analysis, certainly on, I'd sort of say, sand-based greens, maybe on an annual basis, to keep an eye on both potassium and the soil pH, would sort of just give you a sort of sense of whether you needed to sort of try and make any changes, or just certainly sort of give you a sort of sense of the level of risk of a disease attack developing. We would always recommend.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's good. But I mean, there are I mean, it's a brilliant piece of work, isn't it? Coming out of Rutgers, and there were some other factors that they identified, and top dressing was one, and that's kind of like the sort of the amount of top dressing, but also the timing of your top dressing had sort of a huge influence. What did they find out, Andy?
Yeah, top dressing was critical as well. And I think in some very early research, the suggestion was that top dressing could increase the incidence of anthracnose. They disproved that completely. They showed that top dressing was an important management practice to reduce anthracnose levels. They were recommending about 5 tons per hectare every 2 weeks through the summer, if that's possible. Trying to get 80 tons of top dressing on over the course of the year. I think the work on that was fairly clear. They did recognize that sometimes it's difficult to apply top dressing through the playing season on a very busy course or with limited staff. And they said in those cases, a heavier application in the spring was more effective than a heavier application in the autumn at reducing the severity of the disease. And they were talking about 40 tons over the greens in the spring would be a good target to aim for, and that amount was better applied in the spring than in the autumn. So top dressing was clear. I remember seeing Bruce Clark present very clearly. He felt that the application of top dressing was protecting the crown of the plant, and that protection of the crown of the plant just reduced the stress on the plant a little bit, and potentially that reduced stress reduce the incidence of the disease. And certainly by protecting that crown of the plant and putting regular top dressing in, you might make your mowing practices more effective. And mowing was another critical practice that they brought up. And the height of cut at which you mow is important as well. What have been your observations on that over the past few years?
Well, there's been lots of discussion about heights of cut, haven't there? The great 2 mil debate that we had, and of course mowing is a kind of a key factor when it comes to sort of the production of playing qualities. If we sort of go back to the sustainability debate or the 2 mil debate, whatever it was, playing qualities won. That was the sort of that was the thing, and over the sort of I suppose over the time, cutting heights have sort of reduced. I don't necessarily believe that they're sort of reducing on an ongoing basis, but they're certainly a lot lower than they used to be on a routine basis. You just got to think, well, that does have a place stress on the sword, and I would think that would have a massive influence on the level of anthracnose. What did the sort of research study say about that?
Yeah, I think you're right there. I think a lot of the textbooks would say straight out that the reduced height of cutting for longer periods through the summer in more recent years has led to a greater instance of anthracnose. The work was really, really good. They were just contrasting a relaxing of cutting height from 2.3 millimeters to 3.2 millimeters. So that change or that increase in cutting height had a significant effect on the anthracnose. So it did significantly reduce the incidence. So going from 2.3 up to 3.2, and just that alone was significantly reducing your anthracnose.
Yeah.
But, even at 3.2, there was lots of anthracnose about. We can, as we say, show a significant reduction, but not a complete eradication of the disease. And this is where all that research out of Rutgers, all that anthracnose research was so good, because it didn't just focus on these discrete factors, nutrition, top dressing, height of cut, how they affected the disease. It also then looked at the interactions between those factors and showed the importance of combining your cultural practices to give an effect. And we've seen that ourselves, haven't we, in some trial work?
Yeah, no, it's sort of, yeah, we've come to understand integrated turf management a lot better. But there's all the idea that sort of individual treatments can sort of have a certain level of benefit, but it might be significant, but usually it's sort of it's partially effective. But when you pull things together, or combine things that have benefits, then they sort of compound. The benefits compound themselves, and can become extremely effective. And that's borne out in this work, isn't it? I mean, when they moved on to sort of look at the interactions between mowing, top dressing, and nutrition, all of a sudden the differences became really, really clear.
Yeah, that's it. And I really like the work. It was really neat. They compared effectively applications of nitrogen from 100 kilograms per hectare per year to 200 kilograms per hectare per year. They looked at top dressing from 40 tons to 80 tons per hectare per year. And then they looked at height of cut, from this level of 2.3 up to this level of 3.2. And they looked at the interaction of all those factors. So they were never comparing to a control. they were comparing to essentially what might be considered best management practice and what might be considered to be a slightly more stressful practice.
Yes.
And the results were really clear. There was one graph that really stands out where you had, you know, the incidence of disease up the one axis, and then you had, you know, your time over the other, and you looked at the interactions of them all. And at the top, the steepest slope, the most anthracnose, was at the lowest level of those three factors. You know, the least nitrogen, the least top dressing, and the lowest height of cut. And then as you changed those factors, as you relaxed your height of cut, or as you increased your top dressing, or as you increased your rate of nitrogen, you decreased the amount of anthracnose that they were seeing on the surface. And it was really clear. And the
There were huge
combination,
differences, wasn't there?
yeah, the combination of the best management practices, you know, was so much better than the three lower levels. It was astounding. So, you know, at 200 kilograms of N, at 80 kilograms of 80 tons of top dressing per hectare per year, and at a height of cut at 3.2 mils, you know, you could keep your anthracnose down at below 10%. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, they were up at sort of 50% of the surface being affected. So a huge reduction.
So these little tweaks just made a huge difference, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course,
Brilliant.
all those practices have an effect on the playing quality of the surface, which, as we know, is important as well. And they did. Well, I don't know. I'll pass it back to you. Which do you think they found was the most critical, or least critical, in terms of the practice to carry out?
Oh, I don't know. The least critical.
Yeah.
Well, I think, I mean, they're all fairly critical, but I think the sort of the sort of point of your question was, you know, if you're in a situation where you know you can't compromise on playing quality, I think what they sort of said was you know, well, you know, do your best management practice, top dressing and nutrition, and the least deterioration would occur if you sort of had your sort of low height of cut. You know, that there was sort of this kind of almost like reality check, or just sort of saying that we understand that, you know, you've got to maintain full roll distances. So yeah, if you keep everything else in place, you know, those heights of cut needn't be so damaging, but there was still a sort of a price to pay for it in terms of increased anthracnose disease.
And they did show, actually, in another piece of research, that you can, you know, double cut on the same day at a higher height, or cut and roll, and that would not increase the instance of anthracnose, but that does protect, you know, your stimp meter readings or your roll distance to try and maintain that quality, you know, if that's possible. We know that in every situation that isn't possible, but you know, it was a nice piece of work for that. So you know, I think I'd recommend to anybody to dig out that work from Rutgers that Bruce Clark has published, you know, going on for the last, you know, I don't know, 10 or 12 years, really. There's some really seminal pieces of research there for people to read to help understand how those factors interact. It's certainly great for me to top up and read through every now and again, just to get a sense of that. And that's probably all we need to cover here, isn't it, Henry? I think, you know, we've had these 3 short technical sessions on anthracnose. You know, we've looked at the identification and the, you know, how the disease occurs. We've looked at, you know, factors that give rise to the disease on the surface and exacerbate it. You know, and in this one, you know, these management practices that can be put in place to reduce the incidence of the disease. You know, it is clear that, you know, no matter what surface you're managing, you know, you don't have to be at the mercy of anthracnose. There are integrated practices that you can employ, you know, that will include, you know, judicial use of a fungicide at the right timing to help you manage through that period. But you know, there are management practices that are very much in the hands of the course manager, you know, about top dressing, you know, decisions on height of cut, decisions on the nutrition that's going on, that enable you to manage or mitigate the effects of the disease quite successfully. Have you got any concluding marks before we finish off?
No, that's good advice, Andy, isn't it? You know, it's just kind of, you know, understand the disease and put together your management practice to sort of try and reduce the conditions that favour its development. Integrated disease management.
Integrated disease management. Well, I hope those watching have found or listening have found that interesting. You know, I hope you've picked up the other videos in the series. Keep your eyes out. I think Henry and I will do a few more of these. We're very happy to get some feedback on how they've done. Watch out for the webinar we'll be hopefully doing in a few weeks' time, and the quiz we'll push out on social media with a focus on Anthracnose. And we'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Yeah. See you again.